Virginia. The game, first produced by indie game developer Variable State, was released in late 2016. The game follows Ann Tarver, a recent FBI graduate, as she investigates the disappearance of a young boy while simultaneously conducting a secret internal investigation on her partner, Maria Halprin. The developers took inspiration from 90s TV, Twin Peaks, Silence of the Lambs, and The X-Files. At the time of release, it sparked massive debate online, as some found the game to be groundbreaking while others found it to be pretentious and confusing. In my humble opinion, Virginia should be regarded as one of the most innovative games of all time, as it experiments with dialogue, cinematic editing, and a unique way of offering player autonomy. So Skylar, you may ask, how is Virginia one of the most innovative games of all time? Well, I am so glad you asked. Let's break it down. The player is meant to make interpretations based on body language and text. Although this decision was originally made by developers for the purpose of cutting costs, I believe it heightens the sense of mystery and strengthens the game in the genre. This choice makes the player feel like they are taking an active role in solving the mystery. There are no exposition dumps. Instead, the player has to work for every piece of information themselves. But I think something that also might be useful to note, in the first short film I created in film school, it had to be dialogue-free. It challenged us to show and not tell. This choice by my professor wasn't a random one. It forced us to learn storytelling as the original filmmakers did. Early films didn't have dialogue due to the developing technology, but what it allowed was filmmakers to figure out story structure without the crutch of dialogue. It just so happens that video games started with more technology than film did. Video games skipped a few steps in the timeline, and in my personal opinion, could be the reason most players want to skip expository cutscenes. So, one lesson that could be learned for Virginia is go backwards. Ditch the dialogue. Revisit the lessons learned in early cinema. It may be a needed step to finally figure out how story and gameplay could work together seamlessly. Video games and cinema are often compared and contrasted as the mediums are interconnected and at the same time a million miles apart. It's often said that when looking at the timeline of cinema, games fall somewhere where films might have been in the early 1900s. Bottom line, we're early in the development process. We're still trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. In 1903, Edwin S. Porter released The Great Train Robbery. The film is the first time we see modern-day editing techniques like cutting, cross-cutting, parallel scenes. Before this, filmmakers like the Lumiere brothers made films like live theater. They were worried audiences weren't smart enough to understand cuts. And of course, we know that is far from the truth. Audiences are smart, and it's time we start giving them more credit. The game developers for Virginia were inspired by Brendan Chung's 30 Flights of Loving and decided to experiment themselves with cinematic editing. Here, we see Anne walking down a flight of stairs. And then we cut to Anne walking down the basement hallway. Reason being, we don't need to see the player walking down 10 flights of stairs. Games don't usually employ this technique. Famously, Red Dead Redemption 2 makes the players ride across a huge open world map to get from one story point to another. Virginia challenges this. As with The Great Train Robbery, Virginia bets that their audience is smart enough to figure out the passage of time that takes place between cuts. And this was successful. Almost. There were a few instances where this became confusing, but we'll get into that in a minute. We're often taught that what separates films and games is the ability for the player to have a choice in their own story. Mass Effect 2 has 5 endings. Resident Evil has 4. 428 and a blockaded Shibuya has 85 endings. Yeah, we don't have to talk about that one. But Virginia only has 1 ending, and not only that, but only 1 path to get to that ending. The story is set, and the player has to interact with certain objects in order to move the story forward. And while I was taught this is a video game no-no, I think Virginia did a fantastic job at giving the player autonomy, just in unique ways. As mentioned earlier, the no dialogue approach gives the player autonomy in figuring out what the characters are thinking. While I was playing the game, I often found myself coming up with my own dialogue in my head. How cool is that? The game is a mystery, after all, so as mentioned earlier, this gives the player a sense of figuring out the mystery on their own, even though the story itself is already planned out. While the players have no choice but to follow the story exactly how the developers intended, the ending is left so ambiguous that the player is meant to interpret the story as they wish. There are so many fan theories as to what all the symbolism means. Is the buffalo a symbol for Maria? A symbol for Anne's soul? Is the cardinal a symbol for the missing boy or Anne's freedom? What scenes are reality? And what are an LSD trip? Yeah, you heard that right. Is the boy alive? Dead? Abducted by aliens? Is there a big government conspiracy involving the NSA? Well, that's all up to the individual player. Which leads me to gripes people had with the game, which for the most part are wrong, but we'll talk about them anyway. People thought the game is too ambiguous. The game is a mystery, and leaving the player with no concrete ending is frustrating, and I can understand why some people would think that. If the game was a 40-hour epic that left us with more questions than answers, then yeah, I would also probably be upset. But Virginia isn't. It only takes an hour and a half to play, and it's designed to be confusing. The first time, you're meant to replay it and catch all the small clues sprinkled throughout the game. It's meant to keep you thinking long after the credits roll. I know, after I finished, I did an internet deep dive to see what other people thought the ending meant, and that was just as fun as the game itself. People also were wondering, why not just make a movie? This is a walking simulator game. You walk from one trigger to the next, and you experience the story exactly how the writers intended, like a movie. The difference is players can stay in one scene as long as they wish. As long as they don't interact with the trigger, they can walk around and investigate the room as long as they want. They can take as long or as little time as they want in each scene. Also, video games feel more personal. You're not watching Anne figure out the mystery, you are figuring out the mystery. It adds a whole different level of interactivity that films will never be able to achieve. And to circle back, it's confusing. This is something that I agree with. The LSD sequencing in the end didn't work, and it was nearly impossible to distinguish between hallucination and reality. This even led some players to wonder if any of the game was reality, and we know that it was all a dream. Endings are incredibly frustrating. The ambiguity itself is a positive for me. I wasn't bothered that I didn't figure out what happened to the missing boy because it played into the B-plot of Anne's FBI father. She knew, for her own well-being, that she had to let go. Let go of her father and his secret. Let go of the boy and let go of the FBI entirely in order to find personal freedom and let go of guilt and baggage. That message of freedom directly ties into the story's ambiguity. This is another lesson we learn for Virginia. Ambiguity is accepted by audiences when it's done for a purpose. When this becomes confusing is when things are ambiguous for no reason, like the LSD sequence. And for that reason, I'm completely okay with saying that this game isn't for everyone. There's basically no gameplay or skill required. It's a walking sim, and sometimes a confusing one at that. But as a video game nerd and someone who is obsessed with pushing the boundaries on narrative in games, Virginia is a must-play for those looking to experience a game that pushes game narrative forward. However, as a writer, it's hard not to problem solve. If I was in the writer's room back in 2013, I think one simple change that could have been made to make Virginia less confusing without sacrificing what makes the game unique is she needs to come off the LSD high for the end of the game. We know she's high in the prison cell because the bricks on the wall fall apart and reveal an elevator behind the wall. She gets in the elevator and takes a ride through the trip. But she should have come back up the elevator and into the cell, watching the bricks go back to their original position, showing the end of the trip. That would achieve 3 things. 1, it would make clear that the game up until that point was reality. 2, it would be clear that everything that happened in that sequence wasn't reality. And 3, it would put the ending back in reality and make the final scene feel more like a satisfying ending. It would give the game a catharsis. In conclusion, this game pushed boundaries and experimented with what narrative storytelling in games can do. It challenged the need for dialogue, cut the story up into pieces with cinematic editing, and challenged the need for a complicated web of storylines. Although this game isn't for everyone, the lessons learned from Virginia lead me to believe it is one of the most innovative video games of all time.